Hello, good afternoon. Let's get started. Today we will be doing lecture 6, which is nervous system part 2. So last week we learned about the kind of like a cellular level, right? How a neuron works, how they communicate with each other. Today's lesson is more about the gross anatomy, right? The entire brain, different regions of the brain. We're going to look at the spinal cord, organization of the spinal cord, and how informations are being transmitted within the spinal cord. Okay, so let's start with the first question here. What are the 3 layers of the meninges from deepest to most superficial? Give a brief description for each. So the meninges, which is plural, are basically 3 separate layers. Okay, individually we call them the meninx. Okay, so the deepest layer, that is the layer that is going to be in direct contact with your central nervous system. That is the pia mater. Okay, pia mater. P-I-A and then mater. Okay. It's a single T, right? It's not meta, it's mater. So pia mater. This is, as I said, the deepest layer, and it's very thin. Okay. Very thin layer that adheres to the central nervous system, which is, of course, made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. And it's kind of like shrink wrapped onto the brain. If you ever buy meat like at a supermarket, right? It comes in a little plastic covering, and usually it touch the like it's vacuum sealed onto the meat in some cases, right? So you can think of the pia mater like that. Yes, so it follows the contour. Contour means like all the bumps and all the grooves. Contours of the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so there you have it. That is the pia mater, the deepest layer of the meninges. Outside of the pia mater, does anybody remember what the middle layer is called? Resembles spider webs. What is the name of the second layer? Oh, someone put it in the chat box. Yep, that's correct, Tina. That is the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid means spider, right? Arachnoid mater. Okay, so this one is spider web like structure. Okay. And the arachnoid mater has the subarachnoid space, and I'll show you what it looks like in a second. And that space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So the subarachnoid space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Okay. And outside of that, the outermost layer is going to be the dura mater. Okay. Dura is durable, it's very tough, fibrous, connective tissue. Okay. And it is in direct contact of the inside of the skull. Of the cranium, right? Like this part, that's cranium. And the backbone, which is called the vertebrae. Okay, or vertebra for plural. So skull is the cranium right here, skull. And the vertebra is basically backbone. All right. Now I don't have enough space here. I'm going to write outside of the box. Okay. The dura mater is actually 2 layers fused together. Okay, they're stuck together, but sometimes at some places they would separate. They would come apart and form an empty space between them. So this is one piece right here. Oh, I cannot show you because I turned on my virtual background. Let me see if I can turn that off to show you. Give me 1 second. How do I turn off the virtual background? Give me a second. I actually don't know how to turn it off, if you can believe that. Anyway, sorry. I'll just have to show you. So like, over here, right? That's one layer of the dura mater. That's another layer of the dura mater, and usually they're together, but sometimes they would separate. They would separate and form a little pocket. Okay. So this whole thing is the dura mater, and the pocket that it forms in the middle, that's called the durovenous sinus. Okay, and that pocket is like along the middle of the brain right there. Okay, so the purpose of a durovenous sinus, if you remember from the lecture, is you will drain excess CSF. Okay, so this whole thing here, that is the dura mater. Okay, 2 layers. All right. Any questions so far? It's 2-layer fused together, but then sometimes, right? Sometimes it separates. So I'm going to show you a model of what that looks like, and we can talk about it and see if it makes any sense. So I'm going to have to share a different screen with you. Okay. Do you guys see the model right here? Yeah. Okay, great. So this is the skull, right? The skull right here, which is part of, again, your cranium, right? The cranium is just like the top part of your skull, I guess. And underneath there, we can see that is the dura mater. Okay, the blue layer right here. Okay, it's touching in direct contact with the skull. Oh my goodness, is this thing gonna keep on popping up? Okay, so beneath the dura mater, you can see all these strands right here. That would be the arachnoid matter, and it's actually a lot of empty space. You can think of it as like the spring in your mattress. There's a lot of empty space there, but that space is filled up with this bluish liquid, which is called the cerebral spinal fluid. It's not actually bluish in real life, right? It's oh my goodness. Let me see if I can sign in so it's not gonna bug me. Remember me, sign in. Okay. 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 Sorry, guys. and now it's completely gone. There we go. Okay. Hopefully that thing won't pop up anymore. And so it's filled with the cerebrospinal fluid and it adds a little bit of buoyancy and cushioning to the meninges, allows you to absorb the shock. And finally, this very thin yellow layer, right? That is the pia mater, right? And you can see there's a groove here in the brain and it just follows it. It's very closely stuck, adhered to the brain itself. And of course, the spinal cord as well. Okay, and then here you have the actual brain. And you can see the brain has like two colors, right? The outer color, it's darker. We call that the gray matter, right? And then the inner portion that's lighter, that would be the white matter. Does that make sense? So we have a similar diagram here on the in the study guide, and I believe we already labeled it in the lecture recording. So there you go. That is the model. Now let's go back to here. Any questions about the meninges before we move on to the protections of the CNS? All right. Describe how each of the following protects the central nervous system. The skull and the vertebral column, the backbone, right? Of course, they are very protective because they are bony structure that offer physical protection, okay, against blunt force. Okay, so if you bump your head against something hard, that's blunt force. If you get hit by something, right, that's blunt force. And direct hit. Okay, that's basically it. The meninges anchor the central nervous system in place. So it's not going to be like rattling around inside your skull. And also, because of the arachnoid layer in the middle, it contains cerebrospinal fluid, which provides buoyancy, like a floating force, right? You try to push a volleyball under the swimming pool or something. It's really hard to do it because of buoyancy, right? So similarly, you have buoyancy inside the skull, and that's why you don't really feel the weight of your brain, right? Because it's kind of floating in there, and it prevents concussion. Okay. So if you think about the head, right? It's a head. There's the skull, and then the brain is inside, right? If you move your head forward really quickly, which way does your brain go? If you move your head forward really quickly, which way does the brain go? Yeah, it goes backwards, right? Exactly. So if it moves too quickly, then it will hit the side of the skull, and that's what creating a concussion. But if the brain is floating inside the cerebrospinal fluid, then it creates like a layer of cushioning, right? That prevents the brain from hitting the inside of the skull. Yeah. Of course, it has limitation. If the force is too great, it will still end up having a concussion, right? So, like professional football player, for example, right? They easily get a concussion because the force of collision is so great. All right, next we have the blood-brain barrier, or the BBB. Okay, these things are formed by astrocyte. You might remember that from last week, and it creates a selectively permeable barrier, right? Around the CNS. Okay. It prevents certain toxins from going into the brain and the spinal cord, but it's not perfect. Okay, many lipid-soluble substance can still cross the BBB and cause harm. Things like mercury, they could go through the BBB and still cause harm. But nevertheless, it's a good barrier that keeps most of the unwanted stuff out of your brain and out of your spinal cord. Last but not least, we have the cerebrospinal fluid. These are formed by ependymal cells. Ependymal cells in the choroid plexus. Okay, so choroid plexus are these like spongy type of tissue that is found in the ventricles of the brain. And within the choroid plexus, that's where you will have the ependymal cells. Okay, and they make the CSF. So the function of CSF is, in addition to cushioning and buoyancy, they also help distribute nutrients and remove metabolic waste. Okay. They also help circulate neurotransmitters and remove excess neurotransmitters. Okay. So you make quite a lot of CSF, about 600 to 700 milliliters per day. Okay. It's created from your blood, the cerebrospinal fluid. Remember lymph that we learned about in end of lecture 2? You get the lymph because the fluid is squeezed out from the capillaries, right? From your blood. So CSF is produced in a similar process, okay? But it's produced at a very specific location in the brain by the choroid plexus. Okay, and these are the cells that are inside the choroid plexus. So over here we have two scans here, and what is wrong with the lateral ventricles here? Okay, first of all, this is a transverse view of the transverse cut of the brain. You cut it this way, okay, and then you're looking at it from the bottom here. And so these two gaps that you see here, that's actually the lateral ventricle. You have two of them, right? Lateral ventricle. And looking at this picture, right? And this is just like a higher portion of it. What is wrong with it? Can anyone tell me? What's wrong with the picture? I guess it's hard to tell without a normal picture, right? But yeah, Tina said fluid pushing out towards the skull. Well, the skull is all here. Okay, so we can't really see whether it's being pushed, but fluid is definitely pushing on the walls of the ventricles, okay? And these lateral ventricles are enlarged. Okay, and you can see, well, you cannot see it, but then the fluid is all pushing against the walls of the ventricle, making it really, really big. Okay, so usually that happens when you have an accumulation of CSF, in the brain. And that could be caused by something blocking the flow of CSF, right? The drainage of CSF. And that creates a condition called hydrocephalus. Okay, hydrocephalus. There is an obstruction of CSF flow. You ever heard of babies who are born with like a bigger than normal head? Anybody heard of that before? Because the skull of the baby is unlike ours, which is pretty much like hardened, right? But the skull of baby is very soft still. The bone has not completely calcified yet. And so if the baby is experiencing the hydrocephalus, all that extra fluid is going to be pushing out on the skull, causing the head to become a little bit bigger. For adults, the head size is not going to change because, again, the skull is pretty much solid, right? It's fully calcified. And so that buildup with pressure is just going to be building up inside and crushing the tissue, right, that are around the edge of the ventricles. So there you have it. That is a hydrocephalus. Okay. Is it a bad thing? Yeah, it's definitely a bad thing. Okay, so they have to drain the fluid. Sometimes they have to install what's called like a shunt. Okay, which is like a tube that drains the excess CSF either out of the body, or they could drain it through the abdomen. Okay, hydrocephalus could be life-threatening if left untreated. It's a bad thing for adults as well. Okay, using a flow chart, show the flow of CSF. Maybe I just show you where the choroid plexus is first. Maybe you haven't had a chance to see that in the lecture recording. So here is the brain. Lots of brain parts, by the way. Like, you definitely have to label the brain a couple times yourself to fully understand it. Now, if you look at any brain, any mid-sagittal brain, okay, any brain diagram that's like the brain cut in half, you will always notice a band like this in the center. Okay, does anybody know what that band is? Anybody remember what it's called? It's 2 words, something. Just want to see. Do you guys have like a busy week or something, or like no time to watch the recordings maybe? Corpus callosum. Very good, Tina. That is the corpus callosum, okay? Corpus means a bundle, okay? Callosum. It's a bundle of white matter, okay? Bundle of white matter, okay? For communication between the hemisphere. Okay, you have 2 halves of the brain, right? Like right half, left half. They need to talk to each other, and they would communicate to each other through this bundle of white matter, okay, which are axons, and it's called the corpus callosum. You can always see the corpus callosum in any brain that's cut in half along the middle. Okay, let me show you another one right here. There you go. That's another brain right here, like a real one, that it's cut along the midline. And can you identify the corpus callosum? Do you see it? I hope you see it, right? Corpus callosum is right here, right? It's not actually that white, but you know, it is white matter. Okay, so that's the corpus callosum, all right? Once you found the corpus callosum, there is a big gap below it. Okay, you see this hole right here, this gap, this hole. Okay, that leads into the lateral ventricle. Like if I stick my hand in there and feel it, it actually is really big inside. Okay, it forms your lateral ventricle, which is like a horn-like structure that is within your hemisphere. Maybe let me see if I can find your picture. Lateral ventricles, brain. Image. Okay, so there it is. This is probably a reasonable one to use. There we go. Okay. I know you cannot see it. It's really small, but there we go. Okay. So this thing right here, this whole thing, the C-shaped thing, that's the lateral ventricle. And if I stick my hand into this gap, I'll be able to feel the entire lateral ventricle. Okay, like if I would draw it for you, the lateral ventricle would look something like this, like a little C-shaped thing. Okay, with a little horn in the back, but you can stick your hand in there to feel it. Okay, so back to our diagram here, right? You can see that is the lateral ventricle. Part of it anyways, okay? Like again, the whole thing is like the C shape, right? Really, really big, but it's within the hemisphere. You can't really see it in this part, but that's the gap that leads into it. Okay? Now, attached to the walls of the ventricles, you will have these like spongy tissues. Okay, those spongy tissues, they are called choroid plexus. Okay, choroid plexus. We already labeled this in the videos, but let's just do it again. Okay, so this is the choroid plexus, which is a vascularized tissue. Vascularized, which means they have a lot of blood vessel. Vascularized tissue, right? There is the ependymal cells. That makes CSF. Okay. That's basically what it is. Okay. Now, once you've made the CSF, it's going to fill up the entire lateral ventricle, and then it's going to flow down to the third ventricle. Okay, so you have two lateral ventricles, or one inside each of the hemispheres, so 1 and 2. And then the third ventricle is down here. And there's your third ventricle, which is what this label is. Third ventricle. Okay. This area here. Okay. And then you also have a fourth ventricle, which is this little triangle looking thing right here. Okay. That's the fourth ventricle. All right. So just to follow the path again, we have the CSF produced here. It's going to fill up the entire lateral ventricle. It's going to flow through a small hole to go to the third ventricle, which would then flow down this narrow duct into the fourth ventricle. Okay, so you can see in the fourth ventricle, you also have your own spongy tissue, right? What is that called again? These spongy tissues that are found in the walls of the ventricles. The choroid plexus, right? Okay, so lateral ventricle has its own choroid plexus, third ventricle has its own choroid plexus, and the fourth ventricle also has its own choroid plexus. And all these choroid plexus, they contain the ependymal cells, which is responsible for making the CSF, okay, the cerebral spinal fluid, which would then fill up all the space in the brain and around the brain as well. Okay, remember, surrounding the entire brain is your meninges, right? Okay, and there is the arachnoid layer, which will be basically be filled up with cerebral spinal fluid. Any questions so far? Are you sure? Okay. So there was a hole here, right? That I said, right? From the lateral ventricle, it's gonna flow through this hole into the third. That hole is called the interventricular foramen. Okay, a foramen is a hole. There are like big ones and small ones. This one is pretty small, and it's connecting two ventricles together. So interventricular foramen. And then you see the duct right here, right? That connects the third and the fourth. That is the cerebral aqueduct. So if any of these things is obstructed, okay, there's like a little tumor maybe that grows here that blocks it, then it might lead to hydrocephalus, right? Okay. There are other reasons for blockade as well. It doesn't have to be a tumor, but that's just one example. Okay, now that we are familiar with all the structures and where things are, let's go back to the questions we were working on earlier. You're supposed to be writing down the flow of CSF, right? Okay, so it begins at the choroid plexus, right? Choroid plexus. Okay, so the choroid plexus, it's found within all the ventricles. Just checking, how many ventricles do we have in the brain? How many ventricles? Yeah, 4. Okay, lateral, that's 2. The third and the fourth. And within each of the ventricles, you would have the choroid plexus. So choroid plexus will produce the CSF and filled up the lateral ventricle. Okay, remember, you have 2 of these things. And then it will also fill up the third. And then it will also fill up, of course, the fourth. Okay, so each of them has the choroid plexus, and inside the choroid plexus, you have the ependymal cells that makes the CSF. Now, the lateral ventricle will drain into the third, and the third will drain into the fourth. And to go from the lateral ventricle to the third, it goes through a tiny, tiny hole. Right? The interventricular foramen. A foramen is a hole. This one connects the 2 ventricles together. From the third to the fourth, there was a duct, right? Remember, a narrow tube that connects them. That is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so that's basically what we have drawn, labeled on the diagram a moment ago. Okay, now in case you did not know this, so this is the brain, and then this is the brainstem. We're looking at it from the back, and the brainstem will come out at the base of the skull and become the spinal cord, right? That's the spinal cord right here. Now, inside the spinal cord, at the center of the spinal cord, is going to be a tiny hole, okay, that runs the entire length of the middle of the spinal cord. So if I take a slice of the spinal cord right here, okay, it's gonna look something like this. There's the spinal cord, and then there's a butterfly shape in the middle, okay, and at the center of it all, there is a tiny hole. That hole is called the central canal. Okay, and it runs the entire length of the spinal cord until it gets to the bottom. Can you visualize this? There's a tiny hole in the middle, right? So after the fourth ventricle, the CSF is going to go into the central canal of the spinal cord. Right? It's going to go down, right? Like that in the middle until it comes out at the bottom where it frails out like a ponytail. And then it's going to go back up, right, through the subarachnoid space. And it's going to go back up on the other side as well. Okay, and then it's going to surround your brain like that. Do you guys understand what I'm trying to draw here? Okay, so we started at the lateral ventricle, right? You have two of them. They drain into the third and the fourth, and then the central canal. And then it just goes all the way back up to the head. Okay, so let me just finish this diagram, this flow chart for you. Central canal of the spinal cord, right? Then it's going to go into the subarachnoid space. Just like the empty space in the in the arachnoid layer, right? Subarachnoid space around the spinal cord. Okay. And then from the fourth ventricle, right? Some of it go to the central canal. Some of it is just going to go into the subarachnoid space around the brain. And then it doesn't matter because eventually they will all end up, they will both end up in the dural venous sinus, where it will go back to the blood. Okay, before you filter them again. So up here, right, this part, if you zoom out, remember earlier today I was saying the dura mater will separate into the pockets, right? Okay, so like up here, right along the center, okay, of your brain, that's where it will open up and it forms the dural venous sinus. Okay, so ultimately all the fluid's going to drain back up here. Right? There's a little pocket, the venous dural sinus that they could go to, and then it will return the CSF to the blood. And then you just repeat the process the whole day. And like I said earlier, you make 600 to 700 of these stuff on a daily basis. Okay. So that's the flow of CSF. Does anybody have any question before we move on? Anything at all? Okay. List 5 types of glial cells and briefly state their function. We learned about glial cells last week, right? Another name for glial cells is neuroglia. And they're supporting cells of the central of the nervous system, right? Not necessarily the central, could be the peripheral as well. So supporting cells of the nervous system. We talked about this last week as well, but let's just go through it again. There is ependymal cells. Ependymal cells, which I just explained to you. They are responsible for forming the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. Give me another one. Anyone? And give me another glial cell.
Schwann cell and oligodendrocytes.
Thank you. Perfect. Schwann cells, which form the myelin, right? The waxy stuff that goes around the axon and speed up conduction. In the PNS, that is, peripheral nervous system, anything that's not part of the brain or the spinal cord. And Purcell also said oligodendrocytes, okay, which form myelin, but this time within the brain and the spinal cord. And the last one is astrocyte, right? Which form the BBB, the blood-brain barrier. Okay. List examples of white matter and gray matter. Probably we should briefly talk about what they are. So white matter is, for the most part, responsible for transmitting signal. Transmitting signal. Okay, they're like cables, basically. Whereas the gray matter, they are more for like integration of information. Okay. So what makes up white matter? Basically, they're made up of myelinated axons. Okay. The myelin, it's actually whitish in color. That's why we call them the white matter. On the other hand, the gray matter, it's everything else that makes up a neuron. So like the cell body. Okay. It could be short, unmyelinated axon. If it's really short, you don't have to put insulation on it. The signal will just be conducted just fine without the myelin. Okay, so that's what they're made up of. And there are several key, several examples of where you will find white matter. I gave you an example of something that is a bundle of white matter today. Does anybody remember what it was called? If you cut the brain in half, you look at it, you will see this bundle of white matter. The corpus callosum, right? That's the white matter. Allows communication between the two halves of the brain, the two hemispheres. Another example of white matter would be the ascending and descending tracks in spinal cord. For gray matter, we have the cerebral cortex, the outside of the brain. We have the butterfly in the center of spinal cord. There's a part of the brain called the thalamus. That's gray matter. It's responsible for filtering sensory information and relaying them. There's also something called reticular formation. It's a web of gray matter that helps us maintain consciousness. Something that I keep on mentioning in class is the fact that in general, in general. Gray matter is found on the outside of the brain and inside of spinal cord, whereas white matter is the other way around. White matter is found on the inside of the brain and outside of spinal cord. Okay. Okay. Let's go through the spinal cord together. So here you can see the spinal cord. These models are available on eCentennial, of course. Okay, you can see this is one of your vertebra, okay, a slice of the backbone, if you would, and in the center of it, that's where your spinal cord is. Okay, the backbone, right? Like these are called spinous process. The thing at the back here, like you can almost feel it, right? If you just rub your hand down the back of your neck, right? Those ridges that you can feel, that's basically the spinous process right here, okay? And that points to the back of the body. And you can see in the middle of it, there is a hole that allows your spinal cord to fit right through, okay? So you can see the butterfly in the center, that is made up of gray matter, and the white matter is the surrounding tissue. Okay. And what we're going to do is we are going to look at the flow of information related to the spinal cord. We talked about the flow of information last class, remember? With the motor neuron and the sensory neuron. So we're just going to put it into perspective for you. So here we go. This is a slice of your spinal cord. And this is the front, okay? This is anterior. And then this would be the back, the posterior. I did this within the recording already, but let's just go through it again, okay? Because I think a lot of you could use a refresher. Okay, so let's say you touch something hot, you touch something sharp, right? There is going to be a sensory neuron that's going to be going all the way, right, into your spinal cord. Okay, so sensory information generally would enter at the back. Okay, so this is sensory neuron. Okay, carrying sensory information, touch, temperature, pressure, texture, all that stuff. It's going to enter at the back. So the butterfly, what matter is the butterfly? Is it white matter or gray matter? Do you remember? The butterfly.
What is gray matter?
That's right, the gray matter. All right, so I'm going to use this color here. It's going to be the gray matter located in the center. Okay, there we go. And within the gray matter, you will find an interneuron. Okay, interneuron like this. And then the interneuron will decode the information, the sensory information, it will decide what to do with it, and then it will send the signal back out, right, through the motor neuron, right? Motor neuron. Now, these two things are actually bundled together, right? With some connective tissue. And that forms your spinal nerve. Remember, you have like 31 of these things. Okay. So if we go back to our 3D model here, right? You can see this here at the back, that would be the the sensory neuron carrying the sensory information, and then the motor neuron will be coming out from the front. But they will become one. They will be bundled together before exiting from the side of your backbone. Okay, and that's your spinal nerve. If I cut open this spinal nerve, I would see both the sensory going in and the motor coming out. Do you understand? And it would be exactly the same on the other side. I hope that makes sense. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to ask. So that was the story like last week, right? What I did not tell you is, at the same time that this is happening, you actually will have a second pathway that carries the information up to your brain. I'm going to erase posterior here. So at the same time, this is going to go up. It's going to go up. And then you will have other pathways from other parts of the body that's also going up, right? Okay, so this here is called the ascending track. Okay, remember, a track is essentially the same thing as a nerve. Right? Nerve is a bundle of axon in the PNS, whereas a bundle of axon in the CNS, in the spinal cord, it's now called track. And this track, it's going up. That's why it's called the ascending track. And it's carries sensory information to the brain. Okay. So it's going to keep on going up, 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 up. And when you get to the medulla oblongata, you're going to cross the middle. And you might remember that. There is the medulla oblongata, cross the midline at the brainstem, at the medulla oblongata. 90% of the track will cross here. Sometimes you cross in another location. And then it will continue to go up on the other side. Okay, so this is like contralateral now, right? On the other side. And it will go up to your thalamus. Okay, if the information is important enough, then it will get projected to the appropriate part of the brain. So in this case, because we're talking about like, touching something hot, it will go to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Okay. Then it will communicate with the primary motor cortex, and then it will just basically come back right down, but this time it's going to come back down from the front before it makes a connection. Okay, so the track that is coming down at the front, that's called the descending track. Okay. And the part that's causing you to do some motor response, that is the primary motor cortex. Okay. So if you think about like touching a hot surface, the immediate spinal reflex, right? The path down here, that's the one that causes you to remove your hand. That's happening at the spinal cord level. Everything else that you do afterwards, for example, like, putting your hand under cold water, right? Blowing air into the hand, rubbing it together to make it hurt less. all those extra things that you do afterwards, that's the brain doing its job, right? So that requires the information to actually go up to the brain before you're able to do all those things. Okay, the immediate moving your hand out of the harm's way, that's a spinal reflex. But anything that is like higher order function occurs after the signal goes up to the brain. And as you can see, this path is like much longer than this short path, right? So a lot of times, like by the time you realize you burn your hand is already off the stove or whatever it was, right? Because the signal takes longer to go up to the brain than it does to basically remove your hand as a reflex. So that's basically what's going on here. Does anyone want to ask anything at all? You guys are like very silent today. I can't tell if you are doing fine or if you're confused. All right. So a couple other things here that might be worth mentioning. Remember there is the hole right there, right in the middle. And what do we call that hole again? Anyone remember? Talked about like a couple of minutes ago.
Central hole.
Yeah, the central hole or canal, central canal, right? Goes all the way down to the end of your spinal cord, right? It's going to be filled with the CSF, right? The cerebrospinal fluid. Right? And of course, you can't really see it here, but this whole thing is going to be surrounded by the meninges, right? Which is what I'm trying to draw here. The whole thing's going to be surrounded by the meninges, the pia mater, arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Okay. All right. Let's finish the page and then we're going to take a break. Give 2 examples of spinal reflexes. So we just described one, right? You're touching a hot surface and you remove your hand. That is a spinal reflex. There are other spinal reflexes that we have in the body, and we specifically talk about 2 examples in the class. Anybody remember any of those? Doesn't have to be the ones from the lecture. It's just like things that you remember, like from your daily experience, that you think is a spinal reflex. Anybody? No? All right. There's like the knee jerk reflex, right? Yeah, go ahead, Mohammed.
Is this that example of spinal reflex that one question was in our last exam? That is, if I saw a rabbit crossing the road and we are driving and then we push that brake, is it the spinal reflex example?
Yeah, that one, I think it would involve the brain because you have to make the decision to like you actually have to process the information that you're seeing a rabbit and it's dangerous to run it through and you gotta step on the brake. So that one, I would think it's not a spinal reflex. Usually spinal reflex is something that's kind of ingrained in our system since birth. Okay. And something like that you probably would have to learn, right? Because you have to learn how to drive first, right? Okay, so knee jerk reflex, right? The one where you hammer your knee a little bit, right? Like I cannot show you my knee. I cannot. I try to put my leg up, but it's too far from the camera. But your knee it's like this is your feet, this is your knee, right? There's a tendon right there. It's called a patella tendon. If you tap on that, then your knee is gonna go forward a little bit, right? So that's a knee jerk reflex. Okay. Another one that we talked about in class is the Babinski, right? Babinski reflex. That's the one where if you stroke the bottom of a baby's foot, then the toes will curl backwards and fan out. Okay, that's called the Babinski reflex, which would disappear by age 2 or so. So if you see the Babinski reflex in an adult, it tells you something is wrong with the spinal cord, right? There might be some spinal cord injury, right? So those are two examples, but the countless example in daily lives, right? Like if you have kids at home and this might have happened to you, you step on their toys and then right away, like you jumped, okay, because the bottom of your feet got poked, and you jumped out of the way. That is another example of spinal reflex, okay? Another one that's kind of fun to try is if you grab onto an object like this, okay, and then if someone come up to you, you know, unannounced, and then they poke you down here with the elbow, okay, what happens is your hand will automatically let go of whatever you're holding on, okay, and that would be an example of a spinal reflex. Okay, another example, one last one. If you put your finger into a baby's palm, what do they do? Anybody know? Anybody got a baby around sometime?
Grasp.
That's right. They grab onto the finger, right? Okay, that's the grasp reflex. They squeeze it, and you know, nobody taught the baby to grab, and they just do it. Okay, it's a spinal reflex. And again, that's something that's gonna go away when you grow up, right? Okay, like if a stranger put their a finger into your palm, you wouldn't squeeze it by reflex. You probably, like, you know, slap their hand and tell them to go away. Okay, example number 2. Question number 9. Give 2 examples of cranial reflex. These are things that involve the brain. A lot of things like swallowing, okay, sneezing, coughing. I know he's just asking for 2 examples. Vomiting. The reason I'm writing all these down is because these are actually all carried out by the medulla oblongata. Okay, so all these things are reflexes that involves medulla oblongata. Okay. Another one would be like pupil size. Okay. When you shine a light at the eye, the pupil goes smaller, right? That's a cranial reflex. Involves the brain. Give 2 examples of skill memory. Okay, skill memories, these are things that are stored in the cerebellum. Cerebellum is located at the back, okay? And one of the functions is to store skill memories. Does anybody remember any skill memory that was mentioned in class? These are things that you repeated motion that you do. There are a lot of repetition that we do in a daily basis. Then all these things are stored in the cerebellum. For example, typing. Okay, you can type with your eyes closed, probably. You'd be surprised, like even with your phone, right? Just typing with your eyes closed. If it's a phone that you've been using for a while, you will be able to type without looking at it, right? Because you store the spacing of the key and all that stuff. You have a mental picture in the cerebellum, and you're able to do that. Another example, please. Skill memories. Riding a bike. Yeah, riding a bike. Exactly. Riding a bike. I don't know when's the last time you've ridden on a bike, but even if you haven't ridden a bike for like 10 years, and I give you a bike, you probably will be able to ride it, no problem. Okay, and after like half an hour practicing, you'll be just, you know, as good as 10 years ago. So these are skill memories. They are stored in the cerebellum and they do not go away. Okay. Another example is like playing video games. Okay, people, if you keep on pressing the same sequence of buttons, right, they're able to do it from memory easily. Okay. Whereas decorative memories, okay, these are stored in the hippocampus. Hippocampus. Okay, and unlike the skill memories, these things are like use it or lose it. Okay, if you don't practice them, you will likely not remember them later. Like the stuff that you learn in this class, right? Okay. How many of you still remember all the stuff that you studied for the first quiz? You might remember some, right? But then certainly not to the same degree that you did when you were studying for it, right? That's because it's an example of a decorative memory, okay? It's stored in the hippocampus, and if it's not recited periodically, then sometimes it's lost forever. But if you recite it enough times, then it becomes your long-term memory, then they tend not to go away, okay? Things like the multiplication table, right, that you learn from a very young age, maybe you have been keep on practicing it, then that pretty much is not going away, even though it's a decorative memory. So example would be like factual stuff, okay, factual information, everything you're learning in this course, that is decorative memory. You might have some formulas in chemistry or in math, that's decorative memory. Do you guys understand? So skill memory, highly persistent. Once you've learned it, it's staying there. Decorative memory, it's the opposite. It's stored in hippocampus, which it's not so permanent. All right. We will stop for a second and resume in about 5 minutes. Okay, so see you in a bit. Okay, let's keep going. Next question. State the function of the limbic system. Okay, limbic system right here. Just to refresh your memory, the limbic system is basically the reward system. Reward system in the nervous system, okay, inside the brain. And basically, it will, when you do something that makes you feel good, the pathway in the reward system will get reinforced, and it will make you want to do that thing again in the future. So what are some examples of things that we do that makes us feel good? Any example? Yeah, eating, right? Usually people say that I love to eat, and every time we eat something good, right, it makes you feel good, and your reward system lights up, and after a while you will want to eat again. And it doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a very important thing. Our ancestors, when we have to forage for food, right, is this yearning, this urge to eat again because it's something that makes you feel good, would drive them to go forage for food, right, to hunt for food. But nowadays, right, because food is mostly readily available for developed countries, then sometimes the reward system it gets hooked up on other things that we do that makes us feel good, and that could light up in the wrong place, like addiction, for example, to drugs. Right? It doesn't have to be like a physical substance that you consume in the body that cause the limbic system to light up. People are addicted to different things, right? Like gambling, for example, video games, right? Shopping in some cases. So when people do these things, for certain individuals, their limbic system would light up and they will want to do it again. And sometimes it kind of gets out of control. And so some of the therapy that involves controlling addiction, it has to do with targeting the limbic system. Okay, so the function, right, let's just write that down. So collectively, all the parts of the limbic system collectively cause pleasant, right, things that feels good, and unpleasant feelings towards your encounters. Okay? So things that makes you feel good, things that makes you feel not so good, all that stuff will be kind of stored in the limbic system, and the limbic system, uses these memories to guide a person's behavior. That will increase the chance of survival. All right. There are 4 parts in the limbic system, and you can remember it by thinking about this picture. Okay. I don't know if you know what I'm drawing, but this is a hippo, and the hippo is wearing a hat. Okay, so the 4 parts of the limbic system is the hippocampus. Okay, and then a hat, H-A-T. Hippocampus, and then we have the hypothalamus. We have the amygdala and the thalamus. Okay, so hippo and the head. Hippocampus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and thalamus. So the function of hippocampus is store memory. And so all these encounters, you got to store them somewhere. Store it in the hippocampus. Hypothalamus is an autonomic response, okay, and hormone secretion. Okay. Some of the feelings that you have is often charged with the presence of hormone. Certain encounters are more memorable if you have certain hormones circulating in your system. Okay, so things that are exciting, things that have significant meaning are more likely to be remembered. Okay, so those feelings, those emotions that are associated with your encounters, that's created by the amygdala. So that's the emotion piece comes in. Okay, remember eating that piece of chocolate? Oh, it makes you feel so good, right? So happy. That emotion. Without the emotional sense, a lot of the information is just filtered out, and it wouldn't be stored in the hippocampus. So let me give you an example. Anybody remember what they had for dinner like last Thursday? Anybody at all? Do you remember what you eat for dinner last Thursday? Is that a no? Nobody remember? You're trying to think about it? Right. It's hard to remember, right? Like I don't even remember what I ate yesterday for breakfast, for example. And why is that? Well, because it was just an ordinary Thursday, right? Last Thursday was just like any other Thursday, and it wasn't anything that was emotionally charged. Just no particular meaning to it. And so your brain just kind of filtered that out, right? It's not worth lighting up the reward system for it, for example. Okay. But if you think about maybe your last birthday, okay, you might remember what you had for your last birthday if it was a memorable event, right? If you went out with friends, families, right, you might remember which restaurant you went to. You might remember people coming over and, you know, what kind of dishes were there, right? There was, again, an emotional attachment to that experience, and that's more likely to be stored in your hippocampus, okay? So your limbic system remembers that, and then, you know, you might want to do that again in the future, and you might want to do it once again. With your friends, with family. Does that make sense? So that's why it's so hard to like memorize all the stuff I'm teaching you, right? Like even sitting through these lecture, right? The only emotion that you might feel is like, oh, this is so stressful, right? Like I can't remember all these things, and then that's not a pleasant type of emotion. And normally speaking, it's very hard to store all that information. Okay. So lastly, the thalamus, that's the one that will filter out things. So filter and process sensory input. Okay, so all these, visual input, sound input, right? The thalamus might filter out information that is mundane, information that are irrelevant, and it will not get past. Okay, so there you have it, the 4 parts of the hippocampus. Of the limbic system. Next, we have to identify the lobe that matches the description. Let's just go through what the lobes are first before we go through those questions. Here is a typical brain, and we should highlight the lobes. So this is the front, this is the back, and right here there's a line that divides the front and the back. And this part that I'm outlining right here, that is the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe. Okay. A lot of things going on in the frontal lobe, particularly all the complicated things that we do happens in the frontal lobe, such as speech. Okay. Voluntary movement. Higher order thinking. Like doing math, doing reasoning, okay, being able to understand then like abstract concept, right? The concept of action and consequences, all those complicated higher order thinking that happens in the frontal lobe. And consciousness. Okay, to name a few. Now there is a important area in the frontal lobe that is located at the back, which is this strip right here. Okay. That is called the primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex. Okay. And each part here is corresponded to a particular body section. So like here might be hand, and here would be the face, and here would be the trunk of the body. And each section will be controlling the movement of that part of the body on the other side. Okay, so like you would have the hand here, right? Hand. So in order to, this is the left side of the brain that we're looking at, by the way. So if you want to move your right hand, this part of the brain will need to initiate a signal. If you damage this part of the brain from a stroke, for example, you won't be able to move your right hand voluntarily. Right? If you damage this part, you might not be able to move the muscle on the right side of your face. So each of these, each of the region on this primary motor cortex is dedicated for a particular body part on the other side of the body. Okay, so I'm just putting hand here as a reference. Okay, you might have face here. Now on the left part of the brain, there is going to be another area right here, which is currently not showing up. But there we go. Okay, that area is called the Broca's area. Broca's area. And it's only on the left side of the brain, okay, for majority of the people. And it enables you to produce fluent speech. Okay, to be able to talk fluently, to use the right vocabularies, to have the correct sentence structures, and so on and so forth. And I don't mean like speaking English necessarily. It could be your own mother tongue, your own language. That language would have certain sentence structures that you have to follow, right? Certain vocabularies to use, and to use it in the right context, in the right structure, it would need to have the Broca's area. If you damage the Broca's area, then you get something called Broca's aphasia, where you won't be able to produce articulate fluent speech. Okay, you'll be using the wrong word in the wrong place, and you'll be speaking in strange sentence structures. Okay, so that's the frontal lobe. All right. Next, we have this thing right here. Okay, this blue part here. That is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe. Okay, and there's just one main function for the parietal lobe, which is somatosensis. Okay, somato means bodily. So these are like senses from the body, okay, things that you feel with your skin. Okay, things that you feel through touching. So there's another important area here that I'm going to highlight. Okay, we wrote this down earlier, but let's just write it down again. That is the primary somatosensory cortex. Remember when we were drawing that pathway from the in the spinal cord when you touch a hot surface? So that information goes up the ascending track, which ultimately ends up in the primary somatosensory cortex, right? So you will process the feeling from the right hand, for example, and then it will communicate with the primary motor cortex to cause some kind of action on the right hand, and it will go back down, okay, through the descending track. So that this here is the primary somatosensory cortex. If you damage this part, right here, then you won't be able to feel the right face. You can still move it, but you can't feel it. If you damage here, then you will feel it, but you can't move it, right? You might have see some stroke patients with like a droopy face. That's because this primary motor cortex is damaged for that side, and the muscle is no longer under their control, so it droops down. So the purpose of the primary somatosensory cortex is to process bodily sensation. Anything you feel with your skin, right? Such as pain, temperature, pressure, something's poking at you, right? Texture, all that stuff. I would be processed in the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay. Whereas the primary motor cortex, right? That's for voluntary movement, right? Right here, voluntary movement. All right, next up. What's this thing here at the back? What's this lobe called? Do you remember what that lobe is called? The very back?
Occipital.
That is correct. Thank you. That is the occipital. Occipital lobe. Okay. And this is for visual. Anything to do with visual information. Okay. Process information that you see, right? Recognizing a face. Okay. Recognizing a symbol. Recreating like a depth perception. Okay. All that happens in the occipital lobe. We have another one here. This is the temporal lobe. Okay. Temporal lobe. This is where auditory information is processed, like hearing things. Also smell. There's a special area here that is going to work together with the Broca's area. This area is called the Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area. It is for comprehension of speech plus writing. Okay. So to understand what people are saying and to understand written instruction, you would need to have the Wernicke's area. Okay, so there you have it. That's basically the whole brain. Now there is a fifth lobe that's located behind the frontal and the temporal lobe. That's called the insula, I-N-S-U-L-A, and that's responsible for taste. And we'll learn that next class. All right, I hope that makes sense. Let's go back to this fill in the blank here. So let's identify the lobe that matches the description. Contains Wernicke's area. We just did that, right? That would be the temporal lobe. Again, this allows you to understand what you are hearing and also understand what you're reading. If you damage it, you won't know what the other person is saying, even though it's a language that you speak, and you can read an instruction and you wouldn't know what you're reading. Broca's area. Where do we find that? If you just look
Frontal.
At the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe. Both of these are left side, left brain only. Usually. You know, there's something called functional MRI. MRI is magnetic resonance imaging, right? Like, so you go into this giant tube, and the magnets would like light up and you can see image of your brain. And for functional MRI, it's like a live thing that you can do. And the person would be asked to do different things while inside the MRI machine. They would like, read a poem, think about the face of your friend, and then immediately in real time, they will be able to see which part of the brain lights up. And that's how they know what part of the brain does well. Okay, so if a person is like reading a story, right, and they're doing the functional MRI, then the Wernicke's area would light up, and only the left side would light up, right, for most people. Contains the primary motor cortex, the area that allows voluntary movement. That would also be the frontal lobe, located at the back of the frontal lobe. Contains the primary somatosensory cortex. That would be the parietal lobe. Okay, for processing bodily senses. Contains the auditory association area. An association area is an area located on the lobe that is specialized in processing and storing a certain type of information. So in this case, is specialized in storing auditory information. That is in the temporal lobe. So like, if you have a special ringtone for certain people that you use on your phone, when that lights up, you instantly remember, oh, it's whoever is calling. That information is stored in the auditory association. temporal lobe. Visual information, occipital lobe. Process information related to smell, temporal lobe. Okay. This is probably one of the most like heavy lecture that you will have in this unit because there's so much to remember. So make sure you spend the time to do it. Cerebellum, okay, located at the back. If this is the brain that we were just labeling, that would be the brain. The cerebellum would be right here. Okay, and then you have your brainstem. So this is the cerebrum, not to be confused with the cerebellum. Okay, that would be the medulla oblongata right here. So three main functions. We already talked about one of them. It stores skill memory. Riding a bike, typing, okay, shooting a basketball. That's skill memory. It's stored in the cerebellum. It also maintains balance and equilibrium. You're walking on the street and you walked over like a rock and you tripped and you did not fall but regain balance, then you have the cerebellum to thank. Okay. Riding the bike, right? Learning how to ride a bike and not tip over. You're training your cerebellum to maintain the balance, shifting your weight as you turn, for example. Last one is that the cerebellum ensures smooth execution of movement. Okay. If you think about you over here, let's say you're holding a basketball and you're trying to do a layup, trying to run up to it and then put the ball in the net. To be able to do that in a smooth manner with no, jerky motion or sudden stop, right? Smooth execution of that motion, that requires the cerebellum. Okay. Same thing with many things. Okay. Path planning, right? In a crowded cafeteria, you want to get through all the people, right? So you plan the path in your head, and then the cerebellum ensure you're able to execute that path, get through that from point A to point B in a smooth manner. Okay, so people who damage their cerebellum, their motions are usually like kind of jerky, and it's usually described like the person is walking as if they are drunk. Okay, because there's a not a smooth execution. Okay, moving on. A lot of these questions here, it's all in the PowerPoint slides, and I take that not a lot of you have gone through the recordings, so please do so, and you should be able to find the answer to these things. And if you can't, it's okay. We can take it up next class. All right, let's take a look at the first one here. On her way to class, Yvonne decides to cross a busy street, but failed to notice a fast-moving car coming towards her. When she finally sees the car, her heart rate and breathing increases, and she feels a burst of energy that helps her quickly move to the sidewalk. Describe how Yvonne's nervous system was able to process the sight of a car with the need to move her legs. Okay, so a lot of things going on here. But basically, it's the pathway that I described to you earlier, right? So the sight of the car coming, right, that's sensory input. It's going to send to which part of the brain? Okay, let's go over here. Okay, so like that's the eyeball. You know what? Let's use a different diagram. Okay. There's a lot of diagrams like right here. Okay. So this is Yvonne, okay, and the car is coming. So the information goes through the eyes, and where does it go next? That information. Where does that go next? Anyone at all?
Yeah, it will go to the occipital lobe.
That's right. Ultimately, it will go to the occipital lobe. Very good. But there is a one stop it needs to go through first. One stop it have to go through. Okay, and that is the thalamus right here. Okay, the thalamus. The thalamus is responsible for filtering sensory information. All the sensory information, except for smell, will have to go through the thalamus first. Okay, so from the eyes, it will send the information to the thalamus, and the thalamus will decide for you if it's something that's important. In this case, the car coming towards you is very important, then it will get sent to the occipital lobe. Does that make sense? In class, I usually do this example. Okay, like I would be, you know, teaching in front of the class, and then when we get to the thalamus, I would sit down behind the podium, and so people cannot see the bottom half of my body. Okay, I just sit down there, and then I would ask the class, does anybody know what color is my belt? Okay, and people usually would just smile and they would have no idea what I'm talking about, right? What color? I don't know. I hadn't noticed. But they have been looking at me for like an hour, hour and a half for the entire lecture, right? So that's a perfect example of how seeing does not equal to processing. Okay, you have been like seeing me for the whole class, but your thalamus have decided that, you know, the teacher's belt color is not important, is not relevant. So it filters out that information, and that actually does not get processed by the occipital lobe, right? Do you understand what I mean? Right, so that's why, you know, we have to filter all these information that are bombarding our senses all the time. If we process everything that is going through our senses, then, you know, we will get sensory overload, right? That's why the thalamus is important. It's kind of like that, you know, filter in your email. It blocks all the junk mail. Only the important stuff gets through. Do you understand? Okay, so everything goes through the thalamus except for smell, right? Smell goes directly to the temporal lobe. Okay, so what happens with Yvonne here is the information that she sees, or with the car coming, it's going to go to the thalamus. Thalamus will project it to the occipital lobe, and in the occipital lobe, you know, you will recognize the car coming towards you is a dangerous thing, and we need to get out of the way. And because you're in danger, what system is activated as part of the motor output? And causing a heart rate and breathing rate to increase. What system is responsible for that? We learned that last class.
Sympathetic.
Sympathetic, that's correct. Thank you. So the sympathetic system is activated, right? And that is the motor output. And then you have the burst of energy to get out of the way. That's basically what's happening there. All right. Let's take a look at the next question. You are walking to class, pondering the intricacy of physiology when you trip over an uneven place in the sidewalk and fall. Unhurt but embarrassed and angry, you jump up and glance around to see if anyone is watching you. So in this case, we're going to look at the role of the cerebrum, cerebellum, and limbic system. Okay, so let's talk about the cerebrum first. Cerebrum. And what is the role of cerebrum in this case? Well, we have the basically conscious perception of senses, of sensory input, right? Sorry, sensory input from various parts of the body, from eyes in this case, okay? There's something called proprioception, okay, which is basically a big word for the perception of motion, like how you are moving, and location, action of body parts. In other words, does the location and the action of your body parts match the current motion of the body? Okay, so your body, your brain actually has a reference picture of how you should look like when you're doing certain things. So if you are sitting there, then you know you should be like this, okay? And your brain would know something is wrong if, for example, your legs are like, you know, up instead of down. That could indicate that you're falling. Okay, so if any time the location of a certain body part does not match the expected position of the parts when you're doing certain things, then your body will try to readjust itself. So that is called a proprioception. Okay, and also voluntary movement. Okay, so all these things are necessary when you are just walking. Okay, you have to look at the roads that you're walking on, right? You have to know, for example, to inhibit your right leg when you move your left leg. All that stuff, automatic stuff, happens in the cerebellum. Okay. Now, when you have the misstep, what happens is there are various sensory area in the brain will detect the missteps. Right? That's where the proprioception parts come in. When you trip and you start falling, right? And falling, you might look, this is a little bit dramatic, but like you're falling onto the ground, all of a sudden, right? Your center of gravity is up, your head is down, your legs are up. None of that match the supposed motion of walking, right? And your cerebrum kind of lights up and you know, send out like a warning sign. Okay, I think you know that's not what's supposed to be happening. So the misstep, the falling, right, and the pain associated with landing. Okay. And then finally, the getting up part, right? The getting up part, that's where the primary motor cortex comes in. Is important for standing back up and brushing off. Okay, so that's basically what the cerebrum does in this scenario. Okay, what about the cerebellum? What is the role of the cerebellum in this case? Well, the cerebellum, one of the three functions is to maintain balance. Maintain balance and equilibrium. But in this case, it failed. That's why you trip. Right? If it was working perfectly, you would be able to regain the balance before falling. So what else does it do? Well, in getting up from the fall, the cerebellum would ensure smooth recovery as you stand up. Okay, as you're standing back up. That's pretty much it. Okay, last but not least, the limbic system. Anybody want to speculate how the limbic system is going to play a role in this particular scenario? And remember, how do you feel when you after you fall? After you fell, how do you feel? Unhurt but embarrassed, right? So which part of the limbic system is responsible for the embarrassment? Feeling of embarrassment? Which part?
Temporary.
Not quite, but good try. Okay, the amygdala, right? The amygdala triggers the feeling of embarrassment. Okay. And anger. Now these feelings are actually important because it helps create an unpleasant memory. So next time, you will pay attention. Okay, if you travel that same road every day, right? Next time you go through there, you will pay extra attention. You're like, I tripped here last time, didn't feel too good, so I better watch out. I better watch my step. Okay. That's it. Any question at all before we do fill in the blanks? All right. Let's go through these. Site of water balance and body temperature, that would be the hypothalamus. Okay, we first learned about hypothalamus in lecture 3 when we talked about fever. Okay. The hypothalamus controls body temperature. You have a total of 12 pairs of cranial nerves. 4 pairs come out of the pons of the brain. Okay, so again, this is the brain, cerebellum at the back. There's a little bulge here. That's the pons. Okay, right on top of the medulla oblongata. Okay. Connects the 3rd and the 4th ventricle. There is a duct, and the duct is called the cerebral aqueduct. Aqueduct. The middle layer of the meninges, that's the arachnoid mater. Collects excess CSF. That is the thing right here in the middle of the head. That's the dural venous sinus. Contains the Wernicke's area. That would be the temporal lobe. Again, the Wernicke's area allow you to understand speech and written responses, written stuff. Okay. Maintain muscle tone, balance, and posture. That is the job of cerebellum. Structure that forms CSF. That is the choroid plexus located at the walls of the ventricles. Layer of the meninges that is in direct contact with the central nervous system. That would be the pia mater. Pia mater. I'm just looking at the caption that's being auto-generated. It's not getting any of these words at all. Looks really strange. Number 10, primary motor speech area. That's the Broca's area. Broca's area. It's usually on the left side, and it allows us to produce fluent articulate speech. Forms the sides of the roof, forms the sides and roof of third ventricle. That would be the thalamus. Third ventricle is located right between the left and right thalamus. Bumps on surface of cerebrum. Any bumps, we call that gyri. Gyrus for singular, R-U-S, singular. Gyri is the plural. An area found on the precentral gyrus, that is the primary motor cortex. Allows voluntary movement. Region on the parietal lobes where all somatosensory inputs are projected. That would be the primary somatosensory cortex. White matter allow communication between the two hemispheres. That is the corpus callosum. Part of the limbic system responsible for memory. That is the hippocampus. Hippocampus. Contains visual association area. Again, an association area is a dedicated location in the brain for processing a particular type of senses. In this case, it's visual, so you will find it in the occipital lobe. Glial cells that forms the blood-brain barrier, that's the astrocyte. A bump on the surface is called a gyrus. A groove is called a sulcus. Sulci for plural, CI. The groove that separates the two hemispheres. Okay, so if you look at the brain from the top, here's your brain. And if you look at it from the top, there is a groove that separates the two halves. Okay, so this groove right here in the middle, that is called the longitudinal fissure. Outer layer of cerebrum is called cerebral cortex. It's made up of gray matter. Gray matter. Inflammation of the meninges is meningitis. It could be caused by bacteria, virus, or even fungus. Stiff neck, headaches. Need to seek medical attention. Accumulation of CSF, that's the hydrocephalus, right? Caused by the buildup of CSF in the brain because it's not draining properly. There's a blockade. Areas of the brain where integration occurs and where memories are stored, that's the association area. Each lobe has its own specialized association area for particular senses. Damages to the Broca's area could result in Broca aphasia. And that's when you're no longer able to speak in a fluent manner. General interpretive area for speech, to understand what people are saying, you need the Wernicke's area. Relay center of the brain, that would be the thalamus. All the sensory information goes through the thalamus before being projected onto the appropriate lobe, right? All sensory informations except for smell. Regulate hormones secreted by pituitary gland. That would be the job of the hypothalamus. Okay, so thalamus is this thing. It usually looks like this in a diagram. Okay, an oval with a dot in the center. Underneath is the hypothalamus, and then there is the pituitary gland right below it. Okay, so thalamus. Hypothalamus. Hypo means below, right? And then pituitary gland. There's the anterior pituitary gland and posterior pituitary gland. Just want to show you that on a diagram. I'm just going to erase all these things. Okay. You see the oval with a dot in the center? Anybody see that? What letter is pointing at the oval with the center? With the oval with a dot in the center. Do you guys see it? Yeah, Tina got it. Right here, right? So that is the thalamus. Okay. And between the two thalami, that's where you will find the third ventricle. Now, below the thalamus, you will have the hypothalamus, right? Which is this triangle thing. And there's the dangling thing right here. That's the pituitary gland. So pituitary gland secretes hormones, and the secretion is regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay. All right, let's go back to here. Just a couple more. A web of gray matter running through the brainstem responsible for maintaining mental alertness. That is the reticular formation. It keeps you conscious. Even when you're sleeping, the reticular formation is working in the background. That's why, like, you know, a sudden, if someone drops something when you're sleeping, the bang of the object hitting the floor, that will wake you right up. That's the reticular formation. If you damage the reticular formation, you won't wake up. You will slip into a coma. That's not a good thing. Contains reflex center concerning head movement and response to visual and auditory stimuli. That would be the pons and midbrain. The pons is also where 4 pairs of cranial nerves will emerge. 90% of tracts, the ascending tracts and descending tracts, 90% of them will cross the midline at the medulla oblongata. Excuse me. Last one, stored motor skills. That would be the cerebellum. I think there are 3 more on the next page. Part of the limbic system that governs emotion. Do you remember this one now? We talked about it earlier with the, falling down and feeling embarrassed and angry. What part of the limbic system does that? Amygdala. Sometimes if you have trouble pronouncing words with a Y in it, just change the Y to I. Okay, so amygdala. A reflex that involves curling of toes upward and fanning out of toes when the sole of the foot is stroked. That's the Babinski reflex. Finally, receives all sensory input except for smell. Thalamus. Okay, so there you have it. A lot of things to study for and go through. Please make sure you do that. And as usual, if you need extra help or have questions, feel free to email me. All right. Well, thank you for coming. I will see you all next week. Have a good one. Bye for now.